We're talking about some of these gender difficulties that were going on in the Church of Corinth and in the city of Corinth, probably having situations very similar to our own, and they're trying to use worldly logic to solve these problems as they have confusion over gender and confusion about the Lord's Supper. And it's funny to watch worldly logic. I don't know why this passage was making me think about a episode. Uh, when people were pushing political correctness maybe a little too far. I remember a couple of years ago there was some backlash at some actors who were straight actors, but they were portraying non-straight, homosexual, and transgender roles. And I remember reading one or two of those headlines that they can't play those roles because they weren't actually homosexual or transgender people themselves. And there was a lot of backlash, and I think someone at an Actors Guild meeting must have kind of raised their hand and said, "Wait a minute, aren't we supposed to portray things that we're not? Isn't that the point? It's okay if someone is not that, but they portray that." I don't think George Clooney and Brad Pitt and Matt Damon were actually casino robbers, but I did like those Ocean's movies. But they weren't actually casino robbers; they were playing a role. It's okay for them to play. And I thought, oh, this is going to be big. And you know what? The worldly logic collapsed in on itself as people were trying to fuss about these issues. So that was good. That was encouraging to see that sometimes even the world recognizes that its faulty logic and silly way of thinking collapses in on itself. And again, I'm not trying to belabor these points. It's just we kind of hit some of these passages about the role of men and women in the church. But I think this comes at a good time for us because there is a lot of gender confusion out there. We've talked about that quite a bit. The problem there was confusion about roles and divisions about the confusion about gender roles. There was divisions over these rituals like the Lord's Supper. And to the extent that we face this confusion in the world today, we as a church have to make sure we are facing encountering that confusion with certainty, with conviction, with truth from God's word. We need to face these things with biblical truth, with certainty, with humility, even amidst the difficulties and the tragedies of our lives. So we're going to be talking about finishing these couple verses about the roles of men and women in church, and then we'll move on to a discussion about communion. But the greater point really is we need to have a clear answer. We need to have some clarity as we're trying to help people out there to understand Christianity a lot better. And there are so many misunderstandings, and that's unfortunate. And that's probably because people haven't studied their Bible enough and really been clear on some of these issues. I think we ended up in verses 8 and 9 last week. I might go back over those by way of review, and because I don't remember how far I got. But we're in 1 Corinthians 11, and if you look at your handout, that this kind of gives us the outline, clarifying some differences between women and men. Verses 8 through 16, minimizing confusion about the Lord's Supper. And again, you and I, we think, well, how can you be confused about this? Well, in the early church, this was not handled with a lot of order and with a lot of decorum, apparently. So there were some problems. And I think we fixed a lot of those problems, but it's helpful to go back and think, what were they dealing with where they were undermining the value and the beauty of communion. So let's just start with verses 8 and 9. And again, we're kind of jumping into the middle of a longer passage about the roles of men and women in church. And we talked about this last week. We got up to about verse 8. So let me just read verses 8 and 9 of 1 Corinthians 11. He says, "For a man does not originate from woman, but woman from man. For indeed man was not created for the woman's sake, but the woman for the man's sake." And again, we have to remember a couple of things. In fact, let me just keep reading down through a couple more verses here. Verse 10, "Therefore the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. However, in the Lord, neither is woman independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as the woman originates from the man, so also the man has his birth through the woman, and all things originate from God." So it sounds a little bit like he's kind of a circular argument here, but really what he's trying to say makes a lot of sense. I've summarized verses 8 and 9. Male leadership stems from God creating the first man. It's helpful to remember that when we talk about male leadership in the church, this isn't just men oppressing other people or men oppressing women. There's a creation order that this stems from for men to have leadership roles, and certainly for women to serve in some very powerful and meaningful roles as well. And he makes an interesting point here in verse 8. And again, if I'm repeating myself a little bit, forgive me, and we'll get into new material here in just a minute. Well, most people are born, well, everyone's born from a woman, but the human race comes from God creating a man. And again, we take Genesis 1 through 3 literally. We don't believe that there was some symbolic aspects of it. We think that it was a literal retelling of what happened of God actually creating an actual human being who was of a mature state, and then taking a rib from the man to create a woman. These aren't fairy tales. It's always interesting to talk to people who believe that Genesis 1 through 3 is figurative or poetic, but they believe in the stories starting with Abraham in chapter 12 of Genesis and moving forward. Well, that's literal, right? When does Genesis stop being figurative and suddenly become literal? Or how about we take it all as literal? we take it all as reflecting genuine stories about what happened. And as amazing as the flood story is, we believe that actually happened. The Tower of Babel, uh, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, we believe that these are literal stories. And as such, they give some precedent for how we do things in church. And again, the fact that God created Adam first points to male leadership. That first woman was then created out of the side of a man. And for Paul, the fact that the male was created before the female, again, verifies a standard for male leadership. And you can look into 1 Timothy 2, 12 and 13, as he talks more about that. In verse 9, asserts that the man was created to exercise authority to spread God's glory over all creation. You know, it's hard to, and again, we might have talked about this before, but it's hard to remind ourselves that leadership isn't domination. Leadership is the ability to spread God's glory and invite other people to help and aid in that process. And unfortunately, even in churches, we don't get that sense. In a lot of churches, we kind of have this leadership, CEO, heavy-handed kind of an idea, and you probably sat under that. I've sat under that. I've been on staff under that. It's not pleasant. Leadership isn't some kind of a heavy-handed kind of a thing. It is supposed to be something where we are forging a path for people to have opportunities to spread the glory of God, and that's, I think, what Paul is talking about here. And then of course, he can't be fruitful and multiply without the woman. So she is created as an Ezer, as one who helps. And I think we talked about this last week. Ezer does not mean that she's inferior, because God also is referred to several times as the Ezer of humanity, as the helper. So we should not undervalue those roles. And I think we ended last week by asking some of these questions. Men, are you working hard? Are you managing your sphere of influence and pouring the glory of God and the truth and the compassion of God into those areas? Are you accepting help? If Adam needed a helper, so does every male alive today. Okay, we need helpers as well. And that's an important and an invaluable role to play. Are we accepting help and humbly recognizing our need for it? Women, are you helping the men? Okay, all right. Well, now that I have your attention, I don't know what that was. Maybe someone wants to check on that. I think something just fell. Oh, a table. Okay, a table. Okay, good. It sounded like a gunshot for just a second there. I thought, oh boy, everybody hit the deck. You good? Table fell. Okay, all right, good. All right, good. Those are some simple questions that we need to be asking ourselves. And then, women, are you helping your man, the men in your life, to spread the glory of God, or is it more? Okay. God does not want you to hear, or Satan does not want you to hear this. There's good. Okay. This is smooth. Okay. Well, they're all down now, so we should be good. Yeah, that's right. Okay, we're good. Well, so let's move on into verses 10 and 11 here. Of course, we read down to verse 12. And he says in verse 10, and I think the idea, again, verses 8 and 9, male leadership stems from God creating the first man. I think the idea in verses 10 through 15 is that all must recognize proper expressions of authority. And we talked about this. The expressions of authority might change and might have some cultural aspects to them. The need to present or provide or to exhibit expressions of authority, that does not. We are under authority, and we need to exhibit that and also appreciate how that authority is helpful in our lives. He says in verse 10, therefore the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. And the phrase authority on her head, and some translations say a symbol of authority on her head, or a sign that she willingly places herself under the authority of male leadership. And again, in that day, it was a veil or some other kind of a head covering. Again, we don't have that today, but there should still be some signs of being willing to submit in the church to the authority and the leadership that God has put into place there. The expressions of authority change, or the expressions of submission change, but the principle of our need to submit to authority does not. And then it says those have a symbol of authority on our head because of the angels, which makes a lot of sense. So we can just move on. No, I'm kidding. We'll cover that. Because of the angels, I will confess to you that I got to this. I saw this as we were preparing for last week and this week, and I saw this phrase, because of the angels. I said, no, I got nothing. I have no idea what that means. But I went back through my notes, and I went back through some commentators, and I actually think Paul's making a really powerful point here that I think we risk missing when we talk about leadership and submission and all these kinds of things. The point is, and it's helpful to remember that these things that Paul and Peter and James write, I think a lot of the epistles that they write are probably just some of their sermons transcribed, and then they're sending out to a broader group of people. Paul has dealt with this issue before. He's certainly at some point taught about how great it is for the men in the church to be leaders and for the women to support them in wonderful and meaningful ways. And I just picture some lady coming up to Paul and said, "You want me to submit to my husband? You know what kind of a guy he is? He's kind of a knucklehead. I'm not submitting to him. I'm a lot more better. I'm a lot more smarter. I'm a lot more godly than he is. Or I'm not going to submit to the male leadership of our church. We could, me and my gal friends, we could run this thing better." That's probably true. Okay, that's probably true. But the point is that this is not an issue of competency. It's an issue of role, or to put it this way, submission isn't a punishment for a lack of competency. Submission is something we have the privilege of doing as it reflects the hierarchy that God has created. And when he mentions the angels, even angels. Now, are angels smart? Oh my goodness, absolutely. Are they powerful? Are they gifted? Absolutely. Even angels, as glorious and gifted and competent as they are still required to submit. And you think, why should they have to submit? Look how great, how competent they are. Doesn't matter. That because the competency or lack of competency is not related to submission. Their intelligence, their status, their competency is not an excuse to buck authority. And I think that's the point here. You say, "Oh man, I could lead a lot better than the people here." Well, first of all, maybe you need a little humility. maybe there's that, and maybe that's true. But that's not why we're asking for submission, because you're less competent, because you're not as smart, because you're less godly or something like that. Quite the opposite. Our ability to be humble and to submit to one another is a sign of maturity, and in a lot of ways, it's a sign of spiritual competency. Mentioning the angels is strategic for another reason too. Some of them let the idea of competency get to their heads, and they heard through the grapevine, or they read in their angel email, I don't know what they did, that hey, we're gonna have a big rebellion and against God. Okay, let's do this. And if we're understanding some of these texts properly, Lucifer led a third of the angels at some point in time in a rebellion against God. That was a big mistake. That was an eternal mistake. They thought, you know what? I'm smart. I don't have to submit to anybody. I'm going to buck the authority. All right, go ahead and try. It's not going to work out well for you. So I think this little phrase, and by the way, when it says because of the angels, it's a funny little preposition. It can mean on account of the angels, as an example to the angels, as a reflection of the angels. Either way, Paul kind of inserting this little reminder, hey, think about the angels, how great they are, and yet they still submit, and how terrible of a decision it was for them to refuse to submit. And we should all look at the angels and say, you know what? Wherever I am, I'm gonna submit. I might be more competent, I might be better, I might be smarter, I might have great ideas. Great. By the way, if you have good ideas, funnel them to the leadership. We'll take them. We'd love to hear them. You can have great ideas. And by the way, I've been at churches where you couldn't, where the leadership was not open to these. We're open to let us know. Tell the deacons. We'll talk about it at the deacons meeting, at the business meeting. And yet, we're still expected to maintain our role of submission. Those who didn't submit were drawn into an illogical rebellion against God, and they will have to pay the consequences of that forever. So, with this little kind of what seems like a little remark that Paul makes, I think he's drawing us in. He's inviting us to think about the theology of angels and how their competency doesn't mean that they can just get rid of authority. Submission is not a statement of competency or a lack of competency. By the way, it's worth remembering that Christ too. In fact, if you back up to verse 3, where he says, "I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ." It's worth remembering that Christ is not just competent relative to God. We believe that he is God. That he is, and the fancy theological phrases we use, is a fundamentally God, ontologically God. He is as much God as God the Father is God. We were talking Friday morning about the Nicene Creed, and it just goes, it bends over backwards trying to help people understand that he is as much God as God the Father is God. And yet, he submits. And if he does that, the rest of us should be thinking about our submission as well. Your willingness to submit could be an example for the angels, or it could be an example for someone else around you. Differences don't demand independence from the genders, men and women, but it means accepting help and aid. And verse 11 talks about that. However, in the Lord, neither is woman independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. God has made us with gender differences and uniquenesses, and we should celebrate those, and we should be willing to use those to recognize our need and dependence for one another. Well, we're all descended from one man. We each came from a woman, and this is a part of God's brilliant balance of gender checks and gender roles. The complementary and interdependent strengths of both genders. He goes on, and I'm not going to belabor this too much in verses 13 through 16, where he's talking a little bit more about some of these cultural expressions. He says in verse 13, "Judge for yourselves, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is glory to her, for the hair is given to her for a covering. But if one is inclined to be contentious, we have no other practice, nor have the churches of God." So again, I think here we're getting very close into some more cultural issues. And again, I want you to notice we're not dismissing what Paul is saying here because he might be using some cultural expressions of authority. We're saying whatever our cultural expressions of authority are, we might want to think about how we integrate those into how we demonstrate authority in the church or to others as well. We'll have to, I think, we're in such an androgynous society that it's hard to really make that distinguish between gender roles. And the world is going to continue to try to eradicate gender roles. But we have to realize that there's a beauty in the difference between them, and to the extent that we can have cultural symbols of authority of one over the other or one in relationship to the other, we should recognize some of those things and utilize some of those things. The length of hair, these are signs of beauty and differentiation and submission. And I think, again, minimizing these things, these roles, I think creates a lot of gender confusion in our society. It's difficult because, we're told that, you just got to look at the, I know this is controversial, I'm probably going to regret saying this, but, we're told you got to look at the inner beauty. That's the thing. And yet every third or fourth commercial I see is for female beauty products. So the world sends to itself some mixed signals. Well, is beauty important, physical beauty, or is it not important? Well, sure it is important because God created us. We look at each other, we enjoy fellowshipping with one another, we enjoy beauty, and those things are important, but they're not all. And for us as Christians especially, the inner beauty of character needs to be needs to be important to us. Now, all of that, and we could talk about that, and you may say, "Well, I see this a little bit different than you do, Matt," and I'm think you're kind of towing the old traditional line, and that's fine. We can disagree about some of these things, but I think verse 16 is important. In fact, it's so important we actually kind of opened with it last week, where he says, "But if one is inclined to be contentious, we have no other practice, nor have the churches of God." I think we'd have some healthy discussions and debates about what cultural expressions of authority look like today, or to what extent different individuals can participate in the role of leadership or different offices in the church. We could have some debates about those kinds of things. But the reality is, Paul is trying to say here, listen, we're spreading the same message to all the churches. This isn't just something for the Corinthian church because they're having gender problems and they're being punished. This is something that what Paul is talking about here about gender roles, this is something he practices and, and teaches to all the churches, not just for Corinth, but even for modern churches. Modern churches are expected to continue to exhibit signs of respect for one another, and to continue to allow the men to lead and to encourage the women to be as involved as possible in that role. And there's a delicate balance there. I would say more broadly, the issue of submission is important. We're in a society where people want to buck authority. We don't want authority. I don't want no one over me. I'm my own person. I'm my own man. I'm going my own direction. Well, you'll probably end up alone if you do that. And that's the problem. In a society like ours, there's value in exercising authority, being under the authority of someone godly, being under the authority of church leadership, being under the authority of someone who can help you grow spiritually, and then growing in your own maturity, and then someday being the authority being in a position of authority over someone else as well. And that's why that hierarchy in church is really so beautiful and so helpful. Well, he's going to transition from this into a discussion of the Lord's Supper, which will take really the rest of this chapter. We'll just get into it here as we start in verse 17 of chapter 11, minimizing some confusion about the Lord's Supper. There's a couple of things here. First of all, you might say, I'm not confused about the Lord's Supper. We do it. It's orderly. We're not doing the kinds of things they are. And that's good. We're not doing the kinds of things they are because we've learned from these examples, and we're trying to do a better job than they did. But it's also helpful to remind ourselves of how important the Lord's Supper is. This is a way that we remember, that we express how critical it is to our salvation. That Christ died for our sins, that it was a gruesome death, and that he rose from the dead. So if we don't recognize the value of this ritual, if we take it lightly, we say, well, we do it every month on the third week of the month, and we did it, now I can go about my business. If we don't take see how important it is to take this seriously and use this as an opportunity to remember the centrality of Christ in our lives, I think we're missing a big opportunity. Let me read verses 17 through 19, just to kind of get us moving in the right direction here. He says in verse 17, "But in giving this instruction, I do not praise you because you have come together, not for the better, but for the worse. For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that divisions exist among you, and in part I believe that. For there must also be factions among you, so that those who are approved may become evident among you." And then he will go on and talk in more detail about the Lord's Supper. So he's kind of setting the stage here. Now, it's funny, at the beginning of chapter 11, before talking about the gender issues, he praises them. He says in verse 2, "Now I praise you because you remember me in everything." So he's saying good things about them. He's kind of turned the corner here a little bit. And he says, you know what? I praised you. I encouraged you. I said, you're doing a good job in these things. But here's some things you're not doing such a good job in. He said he's not commending them here in verse 17 because the church of Corinth was not coming together for the right reasons, for right practice and right doctrines. Rather, they were making the situation worse. He says, okay, you come together, that's great, but it's not for the better, it's for the worse. And this is ironic because remember, we've already talked about this in chapter 10. He's going to continue to do this in chapter 14, talk about this concept of corporate edification. And that means to build one another up. That's why we gather. Listen, we're so fragile, physically, spiritually. We need to get together at least once a week to kind of do we drag ourselves in and say, "Oh, I need some encouragement. I've been studying my God's word on my own, but I need some encouragement from God's word." And we get encouragement from one another. We spend time singing these songs, and we're in passages of scripture. We celebrate communion, and then we go back out into the world, knowing we're probably going to get kind of slapped around and beat up again, but we'll be back together next week. We need that edification. Paul says you're getting together, but it's not making you guys better; it's making you worse. That's problematic. That's problematic for a church. I would say that if you're looking at a church and gatherings are making things worse than better, then that's problematic. And I'm not sure that that doesn't happen today. But edification, building up, improving, growing spiritually, their gatherings were not helping them to do that. Now he says in verse 18, then he says, now in the first place, and this is interesting because in a way this kind of sets up the rest of the book of First Corinthians, because he's going to talk about several important things: communion, spiritual gifts in chapter 12, the need for love and unity in chapter 13, the necessity of orderliness in church services in chapter 14. So he says in the first place, but really this is just a sequence of really important correctives that he needs to inject into the church of Corinth. And all of these issues that we've been talking about gender or Lord's Supper, these were causing divisions. I hear that divisions exist among you. And I'm not shocked. I'm not surprised. In part, I believe it. He's kind of being a little sarcastic here. He says, "Yeah, I'm not shocked that y'all aren't getting along over some of these kinds of issues." You remember, Paul had spent a lot of time in Corinth, and he knows the people there, and he loves them. He wants to help them grow spiritually, but not surprised that there were contentious issues that were driving people apart. He uses the word schisma, or we get the word schism from it, a split or a division. Paul had used this word previously in 1 Corinthians 1:10 and used it again here in 11:18, and we use it again in 12:25. So this idea of divisions and schisms popping up in the church, this is going to continue to pop up throughout 1 Corinthians. These divisions then and now undermine the gospel of peace and unity, and indicated that people were focusing on wrong things rather than on the gospel of Christ. I won't hop on the soapbox for too long, but there's no way the Church of God today can tell the world, "Hey, you guys need peace and unity behind the gospel of Christ," when they look at us and say, "Well, you guys don't seem to have a lot of peace and unity." We've really undermined our credibility as an institution, as God's institution for the moving forward of His word and His will during this age. We've really undermined our legitimacy. Now, to the extent that we can maybe merge with other churches, maybe heal some of that, I think there's some value as long as we're not compromising doctrinal principles or foundational doctrines and practices. But we have these divisions that Paul talked about from the very beginning. He said this is going to cause a lot of problems. Well, 1900 years later or so, it certainly has caused a lot of problems. These divisions undermine the gospel of peace and unity. And like I said, it shows that they were focusing on the wrong things. Now, he says in verse 19 then, so he talks about divisions in verse 18. He talks about in verse 19, he says, so there must also be factions among you, so that those who are approved may become evident among you. And if he says there must be divisions in one verse, and then there must be factions. And to me, factions and divisions are kind of the two sides of the same coin. They're synonymous. But I think he's using a word here. The word there for factions is the word heresis, from which we get the word heresy. And he's going to use this in a variety of ways. He used this of like a division or a sect in Judaism in Acts, or Luke does in Acts. It's used of dissension in a crowd, but sometimes it's used as straightforward heresy. 2 Peter 2:1, which I think the ladies' Bible study, they were in chapter 2 this last week. It starts off with this word heresis, heresy. Okay, and I think the point he's making is, hey, if there's divisions among you, it means there are differences of opinion, and if there's differences of opinion, it means that one of those things is wrong, right? I mean, now again, if we're talking about the decorations or if we're talking about minor doctrinal issues, that's fine. But I think Paul is talking about major issues. Again, he's going to talk about the resurrection. He's going to talk about the spiritual gifts. He's going to talk about gender and the Lord's table. He says, if there's divisions, that means there's topics over which you are dividing. It means one of those topics is right and one or more of them are wrong or heretical. Now, I don't know if they would rise to the level of outright heresy, but it does mean that there is error in the church and that the believers had to come together, read apostolic writings from the New Testament and try to correct some of those difficulties. And listen, every church has little pockets of error that need to be fixed, and that's what we do. No church is perfect. And until we become perfect, we're going to still try to find out what are some errors, what are some problems, what are some wrong thinking, some wrong teaching, some wrong patterns of behavior, and try to weed some of those out. If there are disagreements and serious divisions, someone's wrong on these doctrinal and ethical issues. And again, and then I think the point about at the end of verse 19, so that those who are approved may become evident among you. I think the idea is you have to have internal people and mechanisms and leaders who will stand up and say, listen, I know that you believe a different way, and there's a sense in which we can argue about certain things, but there's a right way, and we're going to do the right thing, we're going to do the right way, and if someone is so offended by that they leave the church, well, that's fine. We have church discipline mechanisms. We have mechanisms in church to help the church be more pure. And we need to, and part of it is submission. Part of it is submitting to the elders or to the leadership and saying, I just need to. I might be wrong on this, and if I'm wrong, you need to let me know that I'm wrong, and I need to be humble enough to say that maybe I am wrong. And not a lot of believers are humble enough to recognize that they might be wrong on some theological issues. Let me push into verses 20 through 22. He says, therefore, when you meet together, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in your eating, each one takes his own supper first, and one is hungry and another is drunk. What? Do you not have houses in which to eat and drink? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? In this I will not praise you. So great series of rhetorical questions there. We'll come back to those in just a minute or two. So fortunately, again, the way we celebrate communion, we try to do so orderly. I've actually never been at a church. I've been at churches that I think were run poorly, but they never did communion poorly. I think we've learned over church history, the crucible of church history has helped us to refine this process. There are different ways of celebrating communion. We tend to pass out the elements. We were at one church where all the people had to come up front and collect the elements and go back to their seats, and then we did it that way. I think there's a dozen ways you can do communion. There's no right way, but it has to be orderly, and I think that's the idea. People can't be out of turn or doing what they shouldn't be doing. So the point is the need for order and decorum. Even saying that, by the way, some people think that it's very snobby. Order. It's got to be orderly. It's got to be. No, it doesn't have to be snobby, but it has to be orderly, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, there's something I think again, if the church were a well-run machine, if the church were doing what it should be doing, I think the world would really want to get on board and say, wow, there's something powerful happening here. It can only be a divine thing. Unfortunately, we're not presenting that to the world, and this is one way in which the Corinthian church was not doing so. So the point is, there need to be order and be orderly and have some decorum. And it's important when we're reminding ourselves and testifying to others as well, something about the most crucial moment in human history, the crucifixion and the resurrection of Christ. If we don't portray that with decorum and order, then what in the world are we doing? And I think that's dangerous, losing that focal point. Paul notes, I'm getting a little off topic here, but Paul notes how important the death and resurrection of Christ is in first. He's going to spend a whole chapter 15, talking about how important the resurrection and the death and resurrection of Christ is, noting that without the resurrection, our teaching and our faith are in vain, chapter 15, verse 14, and we are rather to be pitied rather than heeded, chapter 15, verse 19. If we don't get this right, and if we don't portray this in an orderly way, that's problematic. As a summary verse to 1 Corinthians 14, Paul notes in 14:40, he says, but all things must be done properly and in an orderly manner. There's this principle, and some of y'all can correct me afterward, but there's this principle in physics called entropy. And entropy is the idea that things, I'm overgeneralizing this in a way, but it's basically the issue that things go from a state of greater order to lesser order, from greater order to disorder, which sounds like fallenness. It's just amazing that that science discovers theological truth. But that's the reality of this world. Somebody say, hey, this tends to be what happens, and it's in it's a small physical kind of a context, but I think that applies in a lot of ways as well. Which means that we as Christians who are trying to have an orderly Christian life, who are trying to do spiritual disciplines, who are trying to do our communion and baptism and our preaching and our singing, who are trying to do these things in an orderly way, are not just fighting the chaos of the world, but we're also fighting the chaos of natural decay, that things tend to become less orderly. And we have to get in there and say, no, we're going to create some order and clarification to a world that itself is falling apart. And if we are not that beacon of clarity and of orderliness, no one else is going to provide that for the world. We can always afford to be more orderly, which will also contribute to heightened effectiveness in what we do. Orderliness and being spirit-led are not opposites. And I've been in a lot of places where, like, the pastor just tears up his notes and says, I'm going to speak from the heart. I'm just going to speak from the heart. I worked all week on those notes. I'm not going to. I expect. Don't leave my notes alone. Are you kidding me? Don't tear up my notes. Does the Holy Spirit just show up on Sunday morning? Is he not part of your preparation as you do a Bible study, an elective, or is he not part of that process? He should be. And if you don't sense that he is, then maybe you shouldn't be doing it. Is he part of the special music you're presenting, or a program, or something else that you're doing, or a ministry that you're overseeing, or an event that you're putting together? He should be part of that process, and he will help you to achieve greater order and effectiveness in it if you are yielded to him as you go. Yes, things happen spontaneously. I'm not a very spontaneous person. I've told you before, Martha and I, we have to plan out our spontaneity like 3 weeks in advance. I mean, it just doesn't. It just we're not spontaneous people. Doesn't mean that the Holy Spirit can't jump in and work in a spontaneous manner, but neither does it mean he won't work through the hard work and preparation that you have put into something. Okay, getting back to the text. Paul's expectation is that the Corinthians would come together for worship. How are we doing on time? For worship, teaching, and to celebrate the Lord's Supper. Paul, however, notes that in verse 20 that the reality is that these are not the reasons why they gather. In fact, he says in verse 20, therefore, when you meet together, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. And he says, no, what we just read in Acts 2, that's one of the reasons they get together, to pray and to share resources, and for the teaching of the apostles, and to break bread together, to share the Lord's Supper together. He says, that's not why you guys are getting together. A lot of people have a lot of weird reasons for wanting to go to church today. Not all of them are good. I love it always makes me feel good to go to a church. Yeah, I hope it makes you feel good, but it shouldn't just sit there and soothe your conscience. It should at some point make you feel guilty too. You should just always go to church and never feel guilty. There's something wrong with that church if you're never feeling the prick of conviction from the Holy Spirit. You should feel that too, and then to do something about that, to fix that, to be brought back into right fellowship with God's people, with God, and with Christ. That should be a joy for you, but that there should be more to it than that. And I think Paul is saying here, listen, you just come to eat. That's all you're coming to do. You're not coming to appreciate the meaning of what is going on here. In fact, the word he uses, we use this phrase, the Lord's Supper. He's kind of uses a very, it's the word Lord, but it's kind of an adjectival form, the Lordish supper, the supper that is just uniquely about celebrating the things of the Lord. This isn't a supper for you to eat and get full. That's what you do at home. And that's great. And I hope you have enough. And if you don't, talk to our deacons. We'll get you food. We'll get you what you need. That's not what this is for. This is about the Lord. Not your appetites, not your cravings, not getting what you want, but this is for the Lord. It is a Lord-ish meal, not just any meal, but specifically one to remember the suffering and sacrifice and resurrection of Christ. Communion was not as orderly then as churches do today. Again, I think we've improved in this area. He says in verse 21, for in your part, For in your eating, each one takes his own supper first. And this is the word, this is the verb. It just literally means to take first. And what does it mean to take first? Well, it could mean that some people were, if they were just serving it up front, some people were pushing to the front of the line to get stuff first. One commentator said he wonders if people were kind of sneaking some food before service. Remember, people back then didn't have a lot, so you see some bread, you're going to sneak a little bit and put a little bit in your pocket, and hopefully the pastor, the deacons don't see you. Either way, they were serving themselves first. They were taking first. We talked about this before from 1 Corinthians. There was this kind of cult of selfishness and self-worship, and we're supposed to rally around a table that reminds us of the most unselfish thing that has ever happened in human history by the God-man Jesus Christ, and do this on our behalf. And that we should, in everything we do, reflect that level of selflessness, of self-sacrifice. And they weren't even doing that in a ritual at a time period where they were celebrating the Lord's table. A couple of takeaways here. First of all, think about, and we'll come back. I'm kind of in the middle of this passage here, but we'll come back to it next week. A couple of things to keep in mind. Submission in Christianity is so important. It doesn't mean you're less competent. It doesn't mean you're less smart, that you're less godly. But if you are competent and smart and godly, then help us out. Get on board. Help to raise the competency of what we're doing. Maybe forge a new ministry or get an event started. Whatever you need to do, use your competencies in the process of submitting to the leadership of the church or the leadership of those around you. And also think about, once we do communion, think about how it is an act of selflessness. It is an act of self-sacrifice that was not just about what Christ did, but if you bear the name of Christ, if you are a Christian, it should be something that summarizes our life as well. Great way to end our service this morning is singing Jesus Paid It All, number 134.